At exactly 06:12 a.m. on December 8, 1941, William Murray stood in the absolute center of the Curtiss-Wright main production floor in Buffalo, New York. The air inside the cavernous plant was thick with the scent of cold machine oil, ozone, and the lingering silence of a world that had vanished overnight. The radio in the foreman's office had been on for 24 hours straight, a frantic, static-filled stream of reports from 3,000 miles away. Pearl Harbor was burning. The backbone of the Pacific Fleet was twisted steel and ash. Murray looked down the assembly line, which stretched like a long gray highway into the darkness of the unlit bays. 37 P-40 Warhawk engines sat there, half-finished, their steel guts exposed. Outside the reinforced windows, the city of Buffalo was still asleep, blanketed in a deceptive peace. But inside, the machines had already started their low, rhythmic growl. The telegram arrived at 0900 hours. It bore the seal of the War Department, Priority 1. The message was only 3 lines long, but it carried the weight of a civilization. Double production, triple shifts, no delays permitted. Murray read the words twice, his fingers tracing the ink. He didn't hesitate. He walked to the planning office, grabbed the edges of every civilian blueprint on the wall, designs for profit, designs for peace, and ripped them down until the plaster was bare. Before we continue, if stories about the invisible hands that forged the steel of victory matter to you, hit that subscribe button. We are going back to a time when seconds were measured in lives. In December 1941, the United States was a sleeping giant with paper muscles. The Army Air Forces had fewer than 2,000 combat-ready planes. Japan had 4,000. Germany had 5,000 more. While Messerschmitts were screaming over London, American factories were busy churning out shiny refrigerators, radios, and family cars. The assembly lines ran a polite 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. War was just a headline in a distant newspaper. The factories stood ready, the machines were polished, but they were calibrated for a world that no longer existed. The P-40 Warhawk was our thin line of defense, fast, armored, and bristling with 650 caliber machine guns. It was the fighter of the flying tigers in China and the desert rats in North Africa. But the aircraft was only as good as its heart, the Allison V-1710, a 12-cylinder monster in a V configuration, liquid-cooled, and screaming with 1,000 horsepower at takeoff. The math Muir faced was brutal. Curtiss-Wright was producing 70 engines a month. That's 840 a year. The War Department just asked for 24,000 aircraft by the end of 1942. The bottleneck wasn't a lack of brilliance, it was the tyranny of time. You cannot rush a crankshaft that must be balanced to the gram. You cannot hurry a cylinder bore that must be honed to within 10,000ths of an inch. At midnight, Murray called his engineers. They arrived in heavy overcoats thrown over their pajamas, their eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Murray stood at the front of the room and chalked a single number on the blackboard. 142,000. That was the projected need by 1945. To hit it, they would need to finish one engine every 22 minutes. Every minute, every day, for 4 years. No failure was allowed because every failure was a dead pilot. He looked at the stunned faces of his men and said only 5 words. We start tomorrow. God help us. By January 1942, the Curtiss-Wright factory in Buffalo had ceased to be a mere workplace. It had become the epicenter of the largest industrial mobilization in human history. The expansion was frantic, almost violent. New buildings rose from the frozen New York soil in a matter of weeks, not months. Concrete was poured under the glare of floodlights at midnight, and steel frames were welded toward the stars by dawn. Within 90 days, the factory floor covered 42 acres under a single continuous roof. Assembly lines stretched for half a mile, a gargantuan artery of steel where overhead cranes moved cylinder blocks the size of small automobiles. The noise was no longer human. It was a constant, crushing mechanical roar that vibrated in the marrow of your bones. But buildings and machines were useless without souls to command them. Murray's initial calculations were a cold slap in the face. He needed 180,000 workers. At first, the recruiters swept through Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse, hiring every man who knew how to hold a wrench or read a micrometer. When the local well ran dry, they expanded to Cleveland and Detroit, setting up recruitment tables in bus stations and train depots. The pitch was simple and patriotic: steady work, union wages, and a chance to kill a Nazi from your hometown. By March, they had 20,000 men. It was a drop in the bucket. The arithmetic of war was relentless. To produce 2,000 engines a month, they needed more bodies than the traditional labor pool could ever provide. So Curtiss-Wright did something that shattered every social convention and labor tradition in the United States. They opened the heavy steel gates to women. In early 1942, this was an act of desperation that felt like a revolution. Society had dictated that women were secretaries, nurses, or teachers, fragile beings unsuited for the grime and danger of a factory floor. But the Allison V-1710 engine didn't care about gender. It only cared about hands. It needed steady, precise hands to operate lathes that could sever a finger in a heartbeat and drill presses that screamed with the fury of a banshee. The first wave of women arrived in April. They walked through the gates in floral dresses and white gloves, carrying tin lunch boxes and a heavy sense of uncertainty. They were met with the cold, hard stares of men who had spent 30 years in the grease. Men like Raymond Kowalski. A foreman with a face carved from granite, Kowalski didn't believe in Rosie the Riveter. He believed in tolerances. He handed each woman a pair of heavy canvas coveralls and gave them a choice: change your clothes and learn the machine, or go home. The training was a 2-week baptism by fire. 14 days to master what men took a lifetime to learn. They were taught the language of metal. They learned to read blueprints that looked like alien star charts. They learned that aluminum is temperamental. It tears like paper if you push the bit too hard. They learned that steel has a memory and brass has a soul. They learned to measure in thousandths of an inch, a distance smaller than a human hair, knowing that if they were off by even one, a pilot's engine would seize over the dark waters of the Pacific. By June 1942, 12,000 women were on the line. The dresses were gone, replaced by grease-stained coveralls and tired eyes. They were no longer outsiders. They were the machinists of the American dream. Margaret Howell was 19 years old when the world she knew was dismantled and replaced by the roar of the Buffalo plant. Before the sirens of 1941, she had been a student with a quiet, clear ambition. She wanted to be a teacher. She imagined herself in a sunlit classroom, helping children decode their first sentences, showing them the vastness of the world through the pages of books. But the war didn't just end plans. It consumed them. Instead of a chalkboard, Margaret found herself holding an oxyacetylene torch that hissed with a predatory blue flame, burning at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The work in the welding bay was a brutal test of human endurance. 10 hours a day, Margaret fused aluminum engine mounts together. Aluminum was a temperamental mistress. If it was too cold, the weld wouldn't bond, creating a hidden weakness. Too hot, and the metal would warp, turning a precision component into scrap. She wore a heavy leather mask, thick gloves, and a canvas apron, but the protection was a lie. The heat inside the welding bay in the humid Buffalo summer regularly surged past 100 degrees. The light was so intense that even behind the darkest glass of her mask, the arc flash scorched her retinas, leaving floating black spots in her vision that followed her home long after she punched the clock. The sparks were the worst part. They were tiny, molten projectiles that found every exposed inch of skin. They left craters on Margaret's arms, permanent jagged scars that she learned to treat with a numbing indifference. Everyone had them. At the factory medical station, they didn't ask questions. They just handed out burn, ointment, and bandages like candy. But when Margaret received her first $40 paycheck, more than her father had ever earned as a clerk, the pain felt like a small price to pay. She sent $20 home every week. When her mother opened that first envelope, she didn't cry because of the money. She cried because she knew what those $20 represented. Her daughter, the aspiring teacher, was coming home every night covered in grease, ash, and the scent of burnt metal. But Margaret's precision wasn't driven by the money or even by patriotism. It was driven by a secret she kept tucked in the pocket of her coveralls. Her brother was a pilot, stationed somewhere in the immense, terrifying blue of the Pacific. His letters were ghosts of the truth, entire paragraphs blacked out by military censors, leaving only "Dear Sis" and "I am safe." But Margaret knew he flew a P-40 Warhawk. She knew that every engine mount she welded might be the one holding his heart in the air. In 3 years, through 8,247 individual welds, Margaret Howell never made a single mistake, not one. Every joint was flawless, every bead of metal a silent prayer for her brother's survival. She didn't buy war bonds as an investment. She bought them as proof that she was standing on the line right next to him. She never cashed those bonds, even decades later when times were lean. To Margaret, they weren't currency. They were the physical evidence that she had been part of the invisible force that kept the world from falling into darkness. By 1943, Curtiss-Wright had evolved from a mere factory into a city within a city, an industrial empire that spanned 6 states and breathed with the collective effort of 180,000 souls. Buffalo remained the beating heart, the grand cathedral where everything came together. But the war's hunger was insatiable. It demanded more than one roof could produce. To feed the assembly lines, additional industrial fortresses were erected across the Midwest. Columbus produced the massive, high-tensile crankshafts. Cincinnati machined the intricate cylinder blocks, Lockland manufactured the connecting rods, and Louisville assembled the complex fuel systems. The logistics of this empire were staggering, a high-stakes game of mathematical perfection, where the margin for error was zero. Every single day, dozens of freight trains arrived at the Buffalo terminal, their steel wheels screaming as they carried the raw materials of victory. Steel from the hellish furnaces of Pittsburgh, aluminum from the Alcoa plants in Tennessee, copper from the deep mines of Montana, and synthetic rubber from the new chemical plants in Texas. This wasn't just shipping, it was a synchronized mechanical organism. Each material had to arrive on time, in the exact quantity, meeting specifications measured in microns. A single delay in a rail yard in Ohio could cascade through the entire system like a cardiac arrest. If the crankshafts from Columbus were 6 hours late, the Buffalo line stopped. If a batch of cylinder blocks from Cincinnati failed a microscopic inspection, the entire month's production targets collapsed. Supply chain managers worked 20-hour days, their offices blue with cigarette smoke and vibrating with the constant ringing of direct lines to the War Production Board. They had the power to commandeer rail cars, to strip materials from other contractors, to move heaven and earth. In the industrial hierarchy of 1943, aircraft engines were the supreme priority. Everything else, civilian needs, other industries, even the comfort of the workers, had to wait. The system was not designed for humanity. It was designed for output. It was a mechanical cycle that consumed human labor, raw ore, and electricity, and produced power. By mid-1943, the Buffalo machine was spitting out 2,500 engines every month. By September, that number hit 3,000. The workers weren't moving faster. They were already at the breaking point of human endurance. The numbers climbed because the system became more efficient. Industrial engineers, armed with stopwatches and clipboards, analyzed every blink of an eye, every step a worker took between stations. They eliminated wasted motion until the humans on the floor became components themselves, precise, repeatable, and utterly exhausted. They were the soldiers of the assembly line, fighting a war of endurance without medals, fueled by caffeine, aspirin, and the silent knowledge that their precision was the only thing keeping the sky from falling. Inside the Curtiss-Wright factory, time was no longer measured in hours, but in inches of progress. The assembly line was a relentless mechanical ballet where every motion was choreographed to the second. By late 1942, the plant was producing one engine every 15 minutes. This wasn't a place of human comfort. It was a cathedral of efficiency built on the altar of repetition. Workers like Dorothy Clean spent 8 months installing the same oil pumps, performing the exact same motion 8,000 times. She never saw a Warhawk fly. She only saw the blue-tinted steel of the pumps and the unforgiving gaze of the quality inspectors who walked the line every hour, armed with micrometers and calipers. The strain was more than psychological. It was a physical assault. Repetitive motion injuries, carpal tunnel, tendinitis, chronic back pain became an unspoken epidemic. Workers wore heavy braces, swallowed aspirin by the handful, and kept their eyes locked on the moving belt. To stop was to fail. To fail was to betray the front line. In July 1942, the line claimed a sacrifice. Thomas Brennan, a 54-year-old machinist with 30 years of grease under his fingernails, collapsed at his station. A massive heart attack. He fell forward onto his spinning drill press, a soldier of industry dying at his post. There was no parade for Thomas. There was no moment of silence. As his body was covered with a tarp and moved to the side, the line never stuttered. His replacement arrived within 60 minutes. The war didn't allow for mourning, and the assembly line didn't allow for a void. Brennan's life was reduced to 3 lines in the obituary section of the Buffalo Evening News, but the engine he was working on was finished by dawn. Every completed Allison V-1710 then faced its final judgment, the 50-hour test run. This took place in the test cells, reinforced concrete bunkers with blast-proof doors designed to contain a catastrophic failure. Because when an engine fails at 3,000 RPM, it doesn't just stop, it explodes. The test began with a cold start, a rumble that grew into a window-shattering roar. For 50 hours, technicians behind thick protective glass monitored oil pressure, fuel consumption, and vibrations. They pushed the metal to the edge of combat conditions, watching for the slightest leak or the faintest shudder. If a gasket failed or a bearing seized, the engine was torn back down to its 3,000 individual parts. Every component was examined under a microscope to find the worker, the machine, or the material that had failed. Because speed without reliability was just another word for murder. War is not just a clash of ideologies. It is a brutal trial of materials. By February 1943, the Buffalo machine was at its peak, but the pressure of the line had created a ghost in the machine. On the island of Guadalcanal, at a dirt airstrip called Henderson Field, Lieutenant Daniel Morse climbed into the cockpit of a P-40 Warhawk, serial number 437824. He was 22 years old, a boy from an Iowa farm who had traded his tractor for a 1,000-horsepower engine. His heart beat in sync with the Allison V-1710 beneath the cowling, an engine built in Buffalo just 4 months earlier, assembled by 8 workers, and passed by every inspector with a clean bill of health. The mission was a standard reconnaissance patrol, north along the coast, look for enemy ships, avoid contact. The morning was perfect, the Pacific air a soft 76 degrees. Morse checked his gauges, oil pressure 68 psi, coolant temperature normal. He was 8,000 feet above a sea so blue it looked like glass. But at 0700, the music of the engine changed. It was a subtle shift, a metallic rasp that didn't belong. Within seconds, the oil pressure needle began to fall like a stone, 60, 50, 40. The cockpit filled with the thick, acrid stench of burning lubricants. Something deep inside the engine, an oil pump casting, had failed. Morse fought to stabilize the aircraft, but the Allison had become a silent 1,200-pound anchor. The propeller windmilled uselessly. At 120 miles per hour, the Warhawk hit the water with the impact of concrete. The nose dug in, the tail flipped, and the Pacific swallowed the machine that Dorothy Clean and Margaret Howell had labored over. Daniel Morse survived the crash, surfaced, and watched his aircraft disappear. But the ocean is vast and indifferent. Despite a 3-day search, the grid remained empty. Morse was added to a list. Missing in action. Presumed dead. The failure wasn't Margaret's weld. It wasn't Dorothy's assembly. It was a microscopic fracture in a casting from a foundry in Canton, Ohio. A mold had cracked because the temperature had dropped by a mere 15 degrees during a winter storm. A quality inspector had missed it, not because he was careless, but because he was on his 16th hour of a double shift. His eyes had failed to focus on the hairline defect because he was human, and the system had pushed him beyond the limits of humanity. 300 engines carried that invisible defect. 12 failed. Daniel Morse was one of the 12. It is the terrifying truth of industrial war. Victory is won by 10,000 correct decisions, but it can be lost by a single, invisible mistake. In April 1945, the war in Europe collapsed. By August, the Empire of the Sun surrendered. The relentless rhythm that had gripped the Buffalo plant for 4 years, the screaming lathes, the blinding arcs of Margaret Howell's torch, the thundering test cells, finally reached its coda. On the night of September 2nd, 1945, the Curtiss-Wright factory went silent for the first time in 1,365 days. The machines cooled. The overhead conveyors stopped. Workers stood at their stations, their hands still stained with grease, and waited for an order that never came. The war was over. And suddenly, the people who had built the victory were no longer needed. By October, half the workforce had been laid off. By December, the gates were locked. The city within a city was dismantled as fast as it had been built. Margaret Howell returned to her quiet life. She never finished her teaching degree. The war had changed the shape of her soul. She married, raised children, and worked part-time at a department store. She never welded again. But sometimes, when a plane passed low over her house, she would stop and listen. To the engine's pitch, her fingers reflexively tracing the scars on her arms. Dorothy Clean moved to California, making refrigerators in a factory where the stakes were lower and the ghosts were fewer. She died in 1989, and at her funeral, no one knew she had once built the hearts of war machines. William Muir stayed until 1958, watching the rust consume the assembly lines and the glory fade into bureaucracy. He retired with a gold watch and a silence he never broke. He lived to be 83, taking the secrets of the 142,000 engines to his grave. The Curtiss-Wright factories in Buffalo were demolished in 1974. Today, there are no plaques on the apartment complexes or parking lots that sit where those engines were born. There is no monument to the 18 billion parts or the 426 million hours of labor. But the engines remain. In museums and private collections, a few restored P-40 Warhawks still defy gravity. When an Allison V-1710 starts today, the roar is unmistakable. 12 cylinders of liquid-cooled defiance. If you listen closely to that sound, you aren't just hearing an engine. You are hearing the memory of 180,000 pairs of hands. Hands that blistered, hands that bled, hands that refused to fail when the world was falling into darkness. They were forgotten by the textbooks, but their work saved civilization. This is their story, quiet, invisible, true. The assembly line is gone, but as long as one engine runs, their heartbeat continues.